There is a gas station sitting only a few blocks away from the home of Nancy Guthrie and Tommaso Cioni. At first glance, it looks completely ordinary, just another stop along the road in Tucson. Fluorescent lights, late-night customers, cars pulling in and out without anyone paying attention. But inside that gas station is something investigators quietly looked at very early in this case. A Bitcoin ATM, not near Nancy Guthrie's home, near Annie and Tommaso's, and almost nobody talking about this case has focused on it. That matters because the ransom communications sent after Nancy vanished demanded cryptocurrency, Bitcoin, specifically. Investigators from the FBI reportedly visited that location during the early stages of the investigation. And once you place that detail beside everything else surrounding this case, the entire narrative begins to feel less like a random abduction and more like something far more complicated. Because the further you dig into the timeline, the more the official story begins to fracture. And tonight on Apex Crime Analyst, we are going to follow those fractures one by one. The public was told this case centered around a kidnapping for ransom. That framework took hold almost immediately. A masked figure appears on surveillance footage. Anonymous ransom notes arrive demanding millions in cryptocurrency. The media locks onto the image of a stranger operation targeting the family of a public figure. But there are details sitting beneath the surface of this case that do not behave like a real ransom operation at all. One of those details appeared weeks before Nancy disappeared. On January 11th, someone searched Nancy Guthrie's address online. According to reporting tied to the investigation timeline, that search originated from Tucson, not another state, not a foreign IP, not hidden through some sophisticated routing system. Tucson, the same city where Annie and Tommaso live. The same city where surveillance activity was allegedly unfolding around Nancy's property. And suddenly, two things begin happening at the same time. Someone is physically appearing near Nancy's home, while digital searches connected to her address are being conducted locally from the same geographic area. That is not proof of guilt, but it is an important pattern. Because investigators are always taught to look for convergence. When physical movement, digital activity, and communication patterns begin circling the same locations and the same people repeatedly, those intersections matter. Then there is another detail that pushes this case even deeper into uncomfortable territory. The ransom text allegedly connected to Derek Kaler was not sent to Savannah Guthrie. It was reportedly sent directly to Tommaso Cioni's personal phone. Not the national media personality, not law enforcement, not some public hotline. Tommaso. And the moment you place that beside the Bitcoin ATM, the Tucson search activity, and the local geographic overlap, the case begins forming a very different shape than the one presented publicly during those first chaotic weeks. But even all of that is not the detail that changes the entire direction of this investigation. The detail that changes everything was sitting quietly inside Nancy Guthrie's kitchen. Her medication, Nancy's heart medication, was reportedly left untouched on the counter after she disappeared. According to public statements made by law enforcement, Nancy depended on those medications heavily due to serious cardiac issues. Officials even stated publicly that surviving long without them would have been extremely difficult. Now stop and think carefully about what that means. If this was truly a kidnapping for ransom, then keeping Nancy alive would have been the entire operation. A hostage only has value while they are living. The purpose of a ransom crime is leverage. Money is collected through survival, communication, and proof of life. Which raises the question nobody can seem to answer. Why leave behind the one thing keeping the hostage alive? The medication was visible, accessible, easy to take. You do not need medical expertise to understand its importance. If criminals are entering a home to abduct an elderly woman for profit, and they see prescription bottles sitting on the counter, those bottles go with the hostage every single time. Because even inexperienced kidnappers understand one basic rule: a dead hostage destroys the negotiation. But, according to the publicly discussed evidence, the medication remained exactly where it was. That single contradiction tears directly into the center of the ransom theory. And once you see it, it becomes impossible to unsee. Because real ransom operations create urgency around keeping victims alive. They establish communication quickly. They prove survival. They create structured demands tied to ongoing leverage. But what investigators and analysts have been piecing together in this case increasingly looks like something else entirely. A narrative attempting to resemble a ransom operation without behaving like one, and that distinction matters a lot. Here is where things become even more unsettling. The same individuals connected geographically to Tucson are also connected to the final confirmed movements surrounding Nancy Guthrie's disappearance. Tommaso Cioni was reportedly the last known person to see Nancy alive after dropping her off at home around 9:50 p.m. that evening. Then silence. Hours of it. And during that silence, according to the developing public timeline, no immediate welfare check occurred. No escalating concern appeared publicly. No urgent response emerged until much later. Again, none of this independently proves a crime. But investigations are rarely solved through one dramatic piece of evidence. They are solved through contradictions, patterns, behavioral inconsistencies, and timeline pressure. That is where this case becomes difficult to ignore. Because once the medication enters the story, the entire foundation underneath the ransom narrative starts collapsing under its own logic. And this is exactly why so many people following the case closely have begun reassessing everything from the beginning. Not because of rumors, not because of speculation, but because one simple question refuses to go away. Why would kidnappers trying to collect millions of dollars leave behind the medication necessary to keep their hostage alive? That question sits at the center of everything. And the deeper you go into this case, the more it starts feeling like the ransom angle may not have been the true motive at all. If you are following this investigation closely, subscribe to Apex Crime Analyst and turn on notifications, because this series is going much deeper into the timelines, communications, behavioral analysis, and geographic patterns surrounding the Nancy Guthrie case. Because this is only the beginning. In the next part, we are going to examine the ransom notes themselves, the wording, the structure, the insider details, and the contradiction that may completely destroy the image of a professional kidnapping operation. And once those notes are placed beside the surveillance footage, the possibility emerges that the person writing the messages may not be the same person seen outside the house at all. That is where this story starts becoming something very different. Subscribe now to Apex Crime Analyst, because the next layer of this case may be the most disturbing yet. The ransom notes changed everything in the Nancy Guthrie case. At least, that is what the public was led to believe. For days after Nancy disappeared, the mystery seemed to center around one terrifying possibility: a carefully planned kidnapping operation targeting the family of a nationally recognized public figure. Anonymous messages demanding cryptocurrency began surfacing. Millions of dollars were allegedly demanded. Deadlines were established. Threats were made. And for a moment, the case appeared to fit the framework of a high-stakes ransom abduction. But the deeper you examine those notes, the less they behave like authentic ransom communications, and the more they begin to resemble something else entirely. Because tonight, on Apex Crime Analyst, we are going to break down the contradiction at the center of those messages. A contradiction so severe that it may completely alter the way this case should be understood. The first ransom communications reportedly arrived within the opening days after Nancy vanished. The timing alone was significant. Whoever sent the messages wanted investigators, media outlets, and the family to immediately believe there was a financial motive behind the disappearance. That framing mattered, because once the public accepts the word kidnapping, every piece of evidence afterward begins getting filtered through that assumption. And that is exactly what appears to have happened here. The notes allegedly demanded millions of dollars in Bitcoin. Specific deadlines were attached to the payments. The amounts escalated over time, increasing the pressure on the family. On the surface, it looked organized, structured, deliberate. But then, another layer emerged. The author of those messages included details that reportedly had not been released publicly. That changes everything. According to public reporting surrounding the case, the notes reference specific conditions inside Nancy's home, including damage connected to a floodlight and the location of her Apple Watch. Those are not broad guesses, Those are intimate details connected directly to the scene itself, which creates an unavoidable question. How does someone know exactly where an Apple Watch was located inside a private residence unless they were physically present there? Or received that information from somebody who was? There are really only two possibilities. Either the writer entered the house personally, or the writer was communicating with somebody tied directly to the scene. And that distinction becomes critical once you compare the ransom notes to the surveillance footage released publicly from outside the property. Because the individual seen near Nancy's home does not project the same level of sophistication as the individual writing the communications. Not even close. The surveillance footage shows someone moving awkwardly around the exterior of the house. The suspect allegedly attempted to obscure cameras using flower pots from the property itself. The behavior looked clumsy, unrefined, improvised. There was no visible evidence of tactical precision or advanced operational experience. But the notes told a completely different story. The writing style reportedly appeared organized and controlled. The structure was methodical. The language sounded composed rather than chaotic. Even media figures discussing the messages publicly described them as surprisingly polished. That mismatch matters more than people realize, because criminal investigations often rely heavily on behavioral consistency. The way offenders move, communicate, threaten, improvise, and manage stress tends to follow recognizable patterns. And here, the behavioral gap feels enormous. One profile appears impulsive and amateur, the other appears calculated and intelligent. It almost feels like two entirely different people. And that possibility opens the door to one of the most important theories surrounding this case. The possibility that the person writing the messages was not necessarily the same person physically appearing outside the residence. An architect and an operative, a planner and an executor, or perhaps something even more unsettling, a staged narrative constructed after the fact. Because once you remove the assumption that these notes were authentic ransom communications, the entire framework surrounding them begins to shift. Real ransom kidnappings operate around leverage. The hostage is the center of the operation. Everything revolves around maintaining control while maximizing pressure on the victim's family. That means communication patterns matter enormously. And one of the most glaring problems in this case is the complete absence of verified proof of life. That is not a small issue. It is arguably the biggest issue in the entire ransom narrative. Think about virtually every documented kidnapping for ransom case in modern criminal history. The kidnappers almost always establish proof that the victim is alive. A photograph, a recording, a voice on the phone, a recent newspaper. Something that proves the hostage survived long enough for negotiations to matter. But according to the publicly discussed timeline surrounding Nancy Guthrie's disappearance, no such proof was ever presented. Not publicly, not reportedly to the family, not through any confirmed channel. Instead, the messages allegedly focused on deadlines, cryptocurrency, and threats, while never conclusively demonstrating that Nancy was alive after the abduction. That is deeply abnormal, because without proof of life, the leverage collapses. And when leverage collapses, the financial motive starts collapsing with it. Yet the public narrative continued moving forward, as though the ransom theory remained intact. Then another note surfaced, and this is where the case takes an even stranger turn. One of the later communications reportedly demanded a dramatically smaller amount of cryptocurrency, roughly equivalent to a single Bitcoin at the time, in exchange for information about the alleged kidnapper. Not for Nancy herself, not for negotiations, for information. That subtle shift changes the psychological profile of the sender completely, because now the communication no longer sounds like an active kidnapper attempting to secure payment. Instead, it sounds more like someone adjacent to the crime attempting to profit from insider knowledge. That is a very different dynamic. And according to reporting surrounding the message, the sender allegedly referenced attempts to contact Annie and Cameron directly, not Savannah. That detail has lingered quietly in the background of this case without enough scrutiny. Because if Savannah Guthrie was supposedly the public-facing target with the financial resources and national platform, Why bypass her in favor of contacting individuals located physically in Tucson? Why focus communication toward the people closest geographically to the unfolding events? Again, none of this independently proves involvement by any individual, but it keeps pulling attention toward the same geographic center, Tucson. The same city connected to the Google search of Nancy's address. The same city connected to the Bitcoin ATM visited by investigators. The same city connected to the final movements before Nancy disappeared. And as these intersections continue piling up, the ransom theory begins looking less like a clean criminal enterprise and more like a narrative struggling to hold itself together. Then came perhaps the most emotionally disturbing development in the entire case: an apology. According to Savannah Guthrie's later public discussion of the communications, one of the messages allegedly carried a tone that sounded remorseful. The sender supposedly implied they did not fully understand Nancy's fragile medical condition, and that changes the emotional profile of the case immediately. Because authentic ransom offenders generally do not communicate emotional regret to victims' families. Their communications are typically transactional, coercive, and emotionally detached. The objective is pressure, not empathy. But this message allegedly carried traces of guilt, almost like someone attempting to soften what had happened. And once again, the contradiction becomes impossible to ignore. The earlier messages project control and intimidation. The later communication sounds emotional and regretful. Those are radically different psychological registers, which raises another difficult possibility. What if the original ransom framework was never the true motive at all? What if the notes were not driving the crime, but reacting to it? Because the moment you start looking at the communications as a narrative device, instead of authentic ransom negotiations, the structure suddenly changes. The first messages establish the illusion of an outside kidnapping operation. The later apology introduces the possibility of accidental harm. The emotional tone subtly shifts the family away from imagining deliberate murder and toward imagining a tragic mistake during a botched abduction. That distinction is enormous psychologically. One version suggests a stranger crime motivated by money. The other suggests something far more personal. And if that second possibility is true, then the ransom notes stop functioning as negotiations and start functioning as staging. A story layered over the crime itself. A framework meant to redirect attention outward, toward strangers, toward faceless criminals, toward anonymous figures in ski masks demanding cryptocurrency, instead of toward anyone close enough to Nancy to understand her routines, her home layout, her vulnerabilities, and the private details later referenced inside those messages. And once you reach that point, the contradictions begin multiplying rapidly. No proof of life, no successful collection attempt, no completed ransom exchange, no continued negotiation structure, no visible operational sophistication matching the tone of the notes, no behavior consistent with maintaining a living hostage, just escalating confusion, layered over an increasingly unstable narrative. This is why the ransom communications may ultimately become one of the most important pieces of evidence in the entire case. Not because they confirm a kidnapping, but because they may reveal an attempt to make the disappearance resemble one, and that possibility changes the direction of the investigation completely. Because if the notes were not authentic leverage tools, then investigators are no longer searching for traditional ransom offenders. They are searching for whoever benefited from the ransom narrative existing in the first place. That is a very different question. And in the next chapter of this investigation here on Apex Crime Analyst, we are going to examine the moment this entire case emotionally shifts direction. The apology. Note: the psychological contradictions, and the possibility that whoever wrote those messages may have been trying to provide emotional closure rather than collect money. Because once the emotional tone changes, the entire case starts feeling less like organized kidnapping and more like a story spiraling out of control. Subscribe now to Apex Crime Analyst. Because the deeper this case goes, the more the official narrative begins collapsing under the weight of its own contradictions. The Nancy Guthrie case changes emotionally the moment the apology enters the story. Up until that point, the narrative still resembles something familiar to the public: a possible abduction, anonymous demands, cryptocurrency. surveillance footage, deadlines, threats. Everything about the case appears to fit the image of a ransom operation unfolding behind closed doors. Even with the contradictions surrounding the notes, people could still convince themselves that somewhere out there, a group of criminals was attempting to extort money from a terrified family. But then the emotional tone of the communications reportedly changed. And when that happened, the entire psychological structure of the case started breaking apart, because what emerged next did not sound like the behavior of hardened kidnappers trying to secure millions of dollars. It sounded like something far stranger, something more personal, more conflicted, almost as if the person behind the communication was no longer trying to control the family through fear, but trying to emotionally manage the aftermath of whatever had already happened. That distinction matters a lot. According to Savannah Guthrie's public comments about the case, one of the later communications allegedly carried a tone that resembled regret. The message reportedly implied that whoever was involved did not fully understand how medically fragile Nancy was. There was language suggesting surprise about the severity of her condition. And the moment you hear that, the case stops sounding like a traditional ransom kidnapping. Because professional kidnappers do not generally communicate remorse to the families of their victims. They do not suddenly soften emotionally in the middle of an extortion operation. Their leverage depends on emotional distance, control, pressure, fear. The hostage is an asset in a transaction. Cruel as that sounds, that is the reality of how these crimes historically operate. But this communication reportedly carried traces of guilt, almost like someone trying to explain what went wrong. And once that possibility enters the story, every earlier contradiction suddenly feels heavier. The medication left behind, the absence of proof of life, the failure to complete any real negotiation process, the lack of operational consistency, the shifting emotional tone of the notes. Individually, each detail creates concern. Together, they begin pointing toward a completely different type of scenario. Because if the apology was genuine, then it may reveal something investigators fear in cases like this: that the original plan did not unfold the way it was intended to. Think carefully about how unusual that emotional shift truly is. The earlier ransom communications reportedly projected structure and authority. Deadlines were attached to payment demands. Large amounts of cryptocurrency were requested. The tone was allegedly cold and controlled. Whoever wrote those messages appeared to understand how to manufacture pressure psychologically. But then, the emotional atmosphere changes. Suddenly, there is regret. Suddenly, there is emotional explanation. Suddenly, the communication no longer sounds like a person focused on collecting money. It sounds like someone trying to influence how the family emotionally interprets Nancy's disappearance. That is a massive difference. Because there are really only two possibilities here. Either the same individual shifted dramatically in emotional tone over a very short period of time, or different people were involved in different stages of the communication process. And that second possibility becomes difficult to ignore once you compare the language styles, behavioral patterns, and psychological framing throughout the case. One voice sounds calculated, another sounds almost humanized. One feels like intimidation, the other feels like rationalization. And when criminal narratives begin splitting emotionally like that, investigators often start asking whether the communications are serving different purposes. Maybe the first messages were meant to establish the illusion of a kidnapping. Maybe the later messages were meant to emotionally redirect the family away from certain conclusions. Because if someone wanted to convince the family that Nancy died accidentally during a botched event, rather than intentionally during something more personal, an apologetic explanation becomes psychologically powerful. It changes the grief process. It changes the anger. It changes where suspicion naturally flows. An accidental death during a failed abduction feels tragic. A deliberate act involving someone close to the victim feels monstrous. And whether intentional or not, the emotional framing of the apology note reportedly nudges the family toward the first interpretation instead of the second. That is why this section of the case is so psychologically important. The note does not merely communicate information, it shapes perception. And that may have been its real purpose. Because when analysts examine criminal communications, they are not just looking at what is being said, They are looking at what emotional outcome the communication is attempting to produce. Fear? Compliance? Confusion? Delay? Sympathy? Closure? And the apology note reportedly carries elements of closure, more than coercion. That is highly unusual in an active ransom situation. Then, there is another problem: the timeline. The primary communications reportedly arrived within the opening days after Nancy vanished. Yet despite the aggressive demands and escalating deadlines, there was never a confirmed public indication that the hostage was alive during those negotiations. No verified recordings, no authenticated photographs, no direct communication from Nancy herself, nothing that firmly anchored the demands to a living victim. And that absence becomes devastating once the apology enters the story. Because if the victim was already deceased very early in the timeline, then the communications take on a completely different meaning. They stop functioning as negotiations. They become narrative management. And this is where the case starts feeling less like organized ransom behavior and more like an attempt to maintain a fiction long enough for investigators and the public to move in the wrong direction. Toward strangers, toward faceless criminals, toward anonymous outsiders, instead of toward anyone connected personally, geographically, or behaviorally to Nancy's daily life. That possibility becomes even more disturbing when you consider the emotional content of the apology itself, because genuine remorse often emerges when outcomes spiral beyond expectation. A person may rationalize involvement in a plan. They may justify intimidation. They may even convince themselves a victim will survive. But when reality suddenly becomes irreversible, guilt enters the equation differently. And some investigators believe that emotional leakage often appears in communication afterward. Not always, but sometimes, especially when the offender has some form of personal connection to the victim or the victim's family. What actually happened inside Nancy's home? That remains unknown publicly. But the emotional inconsistency itself is important evidence, because behavior tells stories that physical evidence alone sometimes cannot. And right now, the behavior surrounding these communications does not align cleanly with a standard ransom profile. It aligns more closely with panic, with explanation, with narrative adjustment after something irreversible occurred. And once you begin viewing the apology through that lens, the entire emotional gravity of this case changes, because suddenly the focus is no longer, where is the hostage? The focus becomes, what happened during the original encounter? That shift is enormous. It moves the investigation away from ongoing captivity and toward the possibility that whatever happened unfolded rapidly, unexpectedly, and perhaps much earlier than the public originally believed. And if that is true, then many of the later communications may not have been attempts to negotiate at all. They may have been attempts to buy time, to redirect attention, to emotionally shape the story surrounding Nancy Guthrie's disappearance before the real truth had a chance to surface. In the next chapter of this investigation, the focus shifts inside the house itself. The untouched medication, the hearing aids, the blood evidence, and the growing theory that something may have gone catastrophically wrong during the very first moments of contact inside Nancy's home. Because once those details are placed together, the possibility emerges that the original plan may have collapsed almost immediately. The deeper investigators and analysts look into the Nancy Guthrie case, the more one possibility begins surfacing again and again. What if the original plan failed almost immediately after entry? Because when you strip away the emotional noise, the media frenzy, the ransom headlines, and the anonymous notes, the physical evidence inside the house begins telling a very different story. Not the story of a controlled kidnapping operation executed smoothly from beginning to end, but the story of something that may have spiraled out of control within minutes. And if that happened, it would explain almost every contradiction that has haunted this case from the very beginning. It would explain the blood. It would explain the untouched medication. It would explain the lack of proof of life. It would explain the emotional tone of the later communications. And it may explain why the supposed ransom operation never behaved like a real ransom operation at all. Because tonight, we need to focus on the moment everything may have gone wrong. Start with the medication. Nancy Guthrie's heart medication reportedly remained inside the house after she disappeared. Public statements made by authorities indicated that her medical condition was serious enough that prolonged survival without those prescriptions would have been extremely unlikely. That fact alone creates a devastating problem for the kidnapping theory, because if criminals intended to hold Nancy alive for ransom, then preserving her health would have been essential to the operation. A living hostage is leverage. A deceased hostage is collapse. Even inexperienced offenders understand this instinctively. And yet, the medication was reportedly left behind. Visible, accessible, untouched. That is not a small oversight. That is the kind of contradiction investigators obsess over, because it suggests motive and outcome may not align. If ransom was truly the goal, taking the medication would have been one of the most important actions during the entire operation. You do not need medical training to understand that an elderly woman with known health conditions may depend on nearby prescriptions. If offenders are organized enough to surveil a property, neutralize cameras, navigate entry points, and communicate through cryptocurrency demands, then missing the medication becomes increasingly difficult to explain, unless the original plan changed unexpectedly, unless the operation stopped being about maintaining a hostage very early into the encounter. And this is where another detail becomes critically important. Nancy reportedly removed her hearing aids before sleeping every night. That detail may sound minor at first, but in practical terms, it changes the entire dynamic of what could have unfolded inside the bedroom. Without those hearing aids, Nancy may have been unable to hear commands clearly, especially in darkness and confusion. Now, imagine the scenario investigators may have considered privately. Someone enters the room late at night. They begin issuing verbal instructions. Get up, move, stay quiet, come with us. But Nancy cannot hear them properly. She does not react the way the intruder expects. Maybe she freezes, maybe she turns the wrong direction, maybe she panics, maybe she physically resists without even fully understanding what is happening. And suddenly, the carefully imagined plan inside the offender's head begins collapsing in real time. That matters because criminal operations built around control often depend on immediate compliance during the opening moments. Once confusion enters the scene, stress escalates quickly. Adrenaline takes over, movements become unpredictable, decisions become impulsive, and that may explain the most disturbing physical evidence in the case: the blood near the front entrance. According to reporting surrounding the investigation, the home itself was described as remarkably undisturbed. No widespread signs of struggle, no chaotic destruction, no furniture overturned throughout the residence. The scene reportedly appeared unusually clean, considering the nature of the alleged crime. But blood was discovered near the front area of the house. That detail is critical, because it suggests whatever physical escalation occurred may have happened during movement toward an exit point, rather than during some prolonged violent struggle inside the home. And when you place that beside the hearing aid issue, the timeline suddenly begins forming a possible sequence. An intruder expects cooperation. Nancy cannot hear. Commands are misunderstood or ignored. Tension escalates. Physical contact occurs. A fall, impact, or injury happens during movement through the house. And now the situation is no longer controlled. Now panic enters the equation, because if an offender unexpectedly injures an elderly woman with severe medical vulnerabilities, the operation changes instantly. The objective may shift from control to concealment, from hostage management to damage control, and suddenly, the untouched medication makes horrifying sense, not because the offenders forgot it, but because by that point, preserving Nancy's long-term survival may no longer have been the focus. That possibility becomes even heavier once you examine the exit routes around the property. According to publicly discussed evidence, multiple access points around the house appeared to have been intentionally propped open, using flower pots taken directly from Nancy's patio. Back doors, gate access points, entry corridors through the property. That level of preparation suggests planning. Whoever moved through that house appeared familiar with the layout. They seemed to know where objects were located even in darkness. They reportedly maneuvered through the property with little indication of confusion or hesitation. But then another contradiction emerges. If the intended escape route involved the back of the property, why does the blood appear near the front? That question may reveal the exact moment the plan unraveled, because operations rarely change direction unless something forces them to, and there may have been signs of disruption. One neighbor reportedly described their dog suddenly barking during the night toward Nancy's property. The timing matters because barking dogs create exposure risk. Lights come on. Neighbors look outside. Cameras become important. Quiet escape routes become compromised. If offenders originally intended to leave through the back, but suddenly feared attention from neighboring homes, the safest route may have shifted abruptly toward the front exit. That would explain why a carefully planned route suddenly appears inconsistent with the physical evidence, and it would reinforce the possibility that whatever happened inside the house was no longer unfolding according to plan. Then, there is the backpack. The surveillance footage released publicly showed the suspect carrying an Ozark Trail backpack during movement around the property. Online speculation exploded immediately regarding what may have been inside it. Tools? Weapons? Restraints? But analysts, looking closely at the footage, noticed something interesting. The bag reportedly did not appear especially heavy. Its weight distribution looked balanced. There were no obvious rigid shapes pressing outward, no clear signs of bulky kidnapping equipment. Instead, some observers believe the bag may have contained softer, folded material. A blanket, a tarp, fabric, and while that interpretation remains speculative, it introduces another unsettling possibility. Because the equipment used to transport and restrain a living hostage often looks different from the equipment used to move a body discreetly, that distinction matters. A real hostage operation generally requires containment tools, restraints, communication control, survival planning, transportation logistics. But, if events inside the house escalated catastrophically and unexpectedly, the priorities change rapidly. Containment becomes concealment. Escape becomes cleanup. Narrative becomes survival. And once that possibility enters the timeline, the later ransom communications begin looking even more suspicious. Because if the crisis unfolded early inside the home, then the subsequent notes may not have been negotiating for a living hostage at all. They may have been attempting to preserve the illusion that one still existed. That would explain the absence of proof of life. It would explain the emotional inconsistency in the apology note. And it would explain why the operational behavior surrounding the case repeatedly fails to align with standard ransom logic. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of all this is how little apparent disorder remained inside the home itself. According to reporting, the residence looked almost untouched, aside from the blood evidence and manipulated access points. That detail keeps pushing investigators toward one uncomfortable conclusion. Whoever moved through that house may have known it extremely well. There are no signs of frantic searching, no evidence of confusion navigating the layout, no indication someone unfamiliar with the property stumbled through the environment under pressure. Instead, the movement appears direct, purposeful, focused, almost familiar, and that changes the emotional gravity of the entire case. Because stranger crimes usually introduce unpredictability into a scene. Unknown offenders make mistakes. They hesitate. They move inefficiently. They improvise badly. But this operation, despite its contradictions, also carries signs of familiarity. Someone knew the property. Someone understood the access points. Someone knew how to move through the darkness efficiently. And if the original plan truly collapsed during the opening moments inside the house, then everything afterward, the notes, the cryptocurrency demands, the emotional apology, the shifting narratives, may have been built on top of that first catastrophic mistake. A mistake that transformed a planned operation into a desperate effort to redirect attention away from what actually happened inside Nancy Guthrie's home that night. Because the deeper this case goes, the more it stops looking like a ransom story. And the more it starts looking like a scene that spun out of control long before the public ever heard the first demand for Bitcoin. At a certain point in the Nancy Guthrie investigation, the focus stops being about ransom notes, cryptocurrency, and anonymous messages. The case narrows, the geography tightens, and attention begins centering on something much more uncomfortable. access. Because when investigators analyze crimes like this, they are not only asking who had motive, they are asking who had familiarity, who understood the environment well enough to move through it confidently in darkness, without leaving behind the kind of chaotic mistakes strangers usually make. And the deeper you look into the physical movements surrounding Nancy's home that night, the more difficult it becomes to ignore one possibility. Whoever entered that property may have known it extremely well. That theory begins with something surprisingly ordinary: flower pots. According to public reporting and discussions surrounding the investigation, multiple access points around Nancy's home were allegedly propped open, using flower pots taken directly from the property itself. Doors, gates, passageways, not random objects brought from outside, but items already sitting on Nancy's patio. At first glance, that detail may not seem important, but operationally, it matters enormously. Because moving efficiently through unfamiliar terrain in darkness is difficult, especially under pressure. People who do not know a property tend to hesitate. They search visually. They make navigation mistakes. They waste time orienting themselves. But the movement around Nancy's house reportedly appeared far more deliberate than that. The flower pots were not just used randomly. They were allegedly positioned strategically to keep access routes open while moving through the property. That implies forethought, familiarity, muscle memory. And once you begin visualizing the mechanics of what that actually required, the implications become harder to dismiss. Picture someone entering a dark backyard late at night. They know exactly where the patio objects are located. They know which gate creates the cleanest movement corridor. They know which doors swing which direction. They know how to move quickly without making noise. That is not impossible for an outsider. But it is far more consistent with someone who has either spent time on the property before, or received extremely detailed knowledge from someone who had. Then there is the route itself. According to publicly discussed details, the manipulated access points appeared to form a pathway through the side of the property toward the rear entrances of the home. In other words, the setup reportedly looked less like random movement and more like a pre-planned corridor. That is significant, because planned entry routes usually indicate preparation before execution. Someone thought through the movement pattern ahead of time. Someone understood how to get in and how to get out. And that raises another critical question. If the back route was prepared so carefully, why does the physical evidence suggest the exit may have shifted toward the front of the house? That contradiction may reveal the exact moment the operation unraveled. Because according to neighbors interviewed publicly about the case, unusual activity reportedly occurred during the night. One nearby dog allegedly became agitated and barked toward Nancy's property during the critical time frame investigators were examining. That detail may seem small. It is not. Experienced offenders fear attention more than almost anything else. Barking dogs create unpredictability. Lights come on. Curtains move. Neighbors wake up. Security cameras suddenly matter more. And if an offender originally intended to leave through the rear of the property, but suddenly believed neighboring attention was increasing, the escape calculation changes immediately. The safest route may no longer be the planned route. The safest route becomes the fastest route. That possibility may explain why blood evidence reportedly appeared closer to the front area of the property, despite indications that the original movement plan centered around the back. Something interrupted the operation. Something forced adaptation. And adaptation under stress creates mistakes. But perhaps the most important physical detail in this entire case involves the front security gate itself. Nancy reportedly had a heavy metal security gate protecting the entrance to her home. Neighbors familiar with similar gates publicly described them as extremely difficult to bypass from the outside. Not the type of barrier someone casually forces open without noise or significant effort. That matters, because surveillance footage reportedly showed the individual outside the property waiting near that entrance rather than aggressively breaching it. And this is where the insider theory begins intensifying dramatically. Because if the gate was locked securely, then investigators have to consider how entry was actually achieved. Did Nancy voluntarily open the gate herself? Did someone already inside open it? Did another individual, With familiarity or access facilitate entry? Those questions sit at the center of the entire case now. Because once investigators begin believing entry required cooperation or insider access, the suspect pool changes immediately. The crime no longer resembles a random outsider attack. It begins looking far more targeted and personal. And when you combine that with the reportedly immaculate condition of the interior scene, the theory becomes even more difficult to ignore. According to reporting surrounding the investigation, the home itself showed remarkably little disruption considering the severity of the alleged crime. No widespread destruction, no obvious prolonged struggle throughout multiple rooms, no signs of frantic searching. Instead, movement through the residence appeared controlled, purposeful, efficient. That detail keeps resurfacing because it contradicts the behavioral patterns commonly seen in stranger home invasions. Unknown offenders tend to create disorder. They misjudge layouts. They move uncertainly. They search rooms awkwardly. They knock things over. They lose orientation. But here, the scene reportedly lacked that type of confusion, which suggests whoever moved through the home either spent time studying it carefully or already understood it intimately. That distinction becomes even heavier when you examine the timeline surrounding the final confirmed sighting of Nancy Guthrie. According to public statements, Tommaso Cioni reportedly dropped Nancy off at home around 9:50 p.m. He allegedly observed the garage door closing behind her, and then the timeline enters a long period of silence. Hours pass, no welfare check, no escalating concern publicly visible during the overnight period, no immediate realization that something catastrophic may have occurred. That silence has become one of the most discussed aspects of the case because it created an enormous operational window. Investigators often pay close attention to silence windows in criminal cases because they can reveal opportunity, time to move, time to clean, time to construct narratives before discovery occurs. And in this case, the timeline gap appears unusually significant. Again, none of this independently proves wrongdoing by any specific person. But criminal investigations are rarely built on single dramatic revelations. They are built on convergence, geographic overlap, behavioral inconsistency, access, opportunity, communication patterns, timeline anomalies, and this case contains all of those elements simultaneously. Then there is the Tucson issue. Again and again, the geography circles back to the same area. The Bitcoin ATM investigators reportedly visited, the online search connected to Nancy's address, the individuals closest physically to the unfolding timeline, the communications reportedly directed toward Tommaso's phone. Everything keeps narrowing toward the same regional center, Tucson. That does not prove a conspiracy, but it absolutely establishes geographic convergence. And geographic convergence matters because random criminal operations usually scatter evidence outward. Here, the opposite appears to be happening. The evidence keeps folding inward toward a very tight radius, connected to individuals already orbiting Nancy's life. Then there is another detail investigators almost certainly examined carefully: familiarity with Nancy's routines. Who knew when she would likely be alone? Who understood the property layout? Who knew the camera positions? Who understood the flow between the garage, gates, backyard, and entry points? Those are not impossible details for outsiders to learn. Surveillance can reveal routines over time, but gathering that level of operational understanding requires planning, patience, and risk exposure. Which raises another uncomfortable possibility. What if some of the knowledge did not come from surveillance at all? What if it came from proximity, from conversation, from familiarity already established long before the night Nancy disappeared? Because the more this case unfolds, the harder it becomes to view the property movement as random. The offender reportedly knew where to go, knew what to manipulate, knew how to move, knew which pathways mattered. And if the original plan truly collapsed during execution, then the rapid improvisation afterward may explain many of the contradictions now haunting the case. The blood, evidence, the abandoned medication, the emotional tone of later communications, and the increasingly unstable ransom narrative layered over the top of everything else. That is why this stage of the investigation feels so important. The case is no longer just about what happened. It is about who realistically could have moved through that environment with that level of confidence. Because once the theory shifts from stranger intrusion to familiarity and access, the entire direction of the investigation changes. And in the next chapter, the focus tightens even further toward the geography, the timelines, the silence windows, and the growing suspicion that the answers in this case may not be scattered across the country at all. They may have been sitting within a very small circle from the very beginning. At the beginning of the Nancy Guthrie investigation, the public was encouraged to look outward, toward strangers, toward masked intruders, toward anonymous criminals demanding cryptocurrency from a frightened family. But the deeper this case has unfolded, the more the evidence appears to be pulling in the opposite direction, not outward, inward, toward a very small geographic circle that keeps resurfacing again and again, no matter which part of the timeline investigators examine. And that may be the single most important development in this entire case. Because when crimes remain unsolved publicly for long periods of time, people often assume the mystery must be incredibly complicated. Some vast hidden conspiracy, some highly sophisticated criminal operation, impossible to untangle. But experienced investigators will tell you something different. Very often, the answer exists close to the victim from the beginning. Close geographically, close behaviorally, close relationally, and right now, nearly every major contradiction surrounding Nancy Guthrie's disappearance keeps circling back toward the same small area in Tucson. That does not automatically prove guilt, but it does establish convergence, and convergence matters. Because one strange coincidence can be dismissed, two may still be explainable. But when timelines, communications, geography, physical evidence, and behavioral inconsistencies all begin intersecting repeatedly around the same locations and individuals, investigators start paying very close attention. Start with the timeline. According to public statements surrounding the case, Tommaso Cioni was reportedly the last confirmed person to see Nancy alive after dropping her off at home around 9:50 p.m. that evening. He allegedly watched the garage door close behind her before leaving, and after that moment, the case enters darkness. No confirmed sightings, no known communications from Nancy, no public indication she spoke to anyone afterward. Just silence. But it is not only the silence itself that investigators focus on, it is the duration of it. Because between that final reported sighting and the growing realization that something was wrong, a significant amount of time reportedly passed. Hours in which no immediate alarm was publicly triggered. Hours in which the property remained isolated. Hours in which movement, cleanup, transportation, or narrative construction could theoretically occur without interruption. That window matters because opportunity matters. And opportunity becomes even more important when combined with proximity. Annie Guthrie and Tommaso Cioni reportedly lived only a short drive from Nancy's residence. Roughly within the same local geographic radius investigators keep returning to throughout this case. That same radius appears repeatedly in other parts of the investigation as well. The Google search connected to Nancy's address reportedly originated from Tucson. The Bitcoin ATM visited by investigators was reportedly located near the same general area. The communications tied to the ransom narrative repeatedly intersected with people connected physically to Tucson. And once you map all those intersections together, the randomness begins disappearing. Because this no longer feels like scattered evidence spread across multiple jurisdictions or unknown networks. The gravity of the case keeps pulling inward toward one concentrated geographic zone. That is important, especially because the original public narrative suggested an outside offender targeting the family of a public figure for financial gain. But outside offenders generally create outward-moving evidence trails, distant communications, unknown networks, hidden identities spread across multiple locations. Here, the opposite seems to be happening. The deeper the timeline goes, the tighter the geographic circle becomes. Then there is the issue of communication patterns. One of the details that continues attracting attention involves the ransom-related message allegedly sent to Tommaso's personal phone. Not Savannah Guthrie, not law enforcement. Tommaso specifically. That may ultimately prove completely innocent. But In investigative analysis, communication targeting matters because it sometimes reveals relational priority. Criminals usually direct leverage toward the person they believe holds the most influence, visibility, or negotiating power. So when communications repeatedly orbit specific individuals physically connected to the operational geography of the case, investigators naturally ask why, and the questions only intensify from there, because there are still unresolved issues surrounding access, familiarity, and operational knowledge inside Nancy's home. Who knew the layout? Who understood the property well enough to move through it efficiently at night? Who knew the likely routines? Who understood the gate systems, access points, and environmental setup surrounding the house? Again, none of these questions independently accuse anyone, but together, they create a framework investigators cannot ignore, especially when combined with the reportedly immaculate condition of the interior scene. That detail remains one of the most psychologically important aspects of the entire case. No widespread signs of violent struggle, no chaotic disorder throughout the residence, no obvious indications that strangers unfamiliar with the environment stumbled through the property under pressure. Instead, movement reportedly appeared direct and controlled. That matters because behavior leaves signatures, and familiarity often reveals itself not through what offenders damage, but through what they do not. People who know environments tend to move differently inside them. Faster, cleaner, more confidently. They know where obstacles are. They know how doors open. They know where visibility changes between rooms. And if the offender or offenders in this case possessed that level of familiarity, then the pool of realistic possibilities narrows considerably. Then there is the issue of the vehicles. Public reporting indicated that Annie's vehicle was reportedly held by investigators for an extended forensic examination before eventually being returned. While law enforcement may retain vehicles for many reasons during active investigations, the length of time attracted public attention because it suggested investigators were examining something carefully rather than performing a routine quick inspection. At the same time, photographs reportedly surfaced showing activity around Nancy's property involving removal of boxes and materials before many of the public questions surrounding the case had been resolved. Again, none of this independently proves wrongdoing, but perception matters in unresolved investigations. And when viewed alongside every other contradiction already surrounding the case, these details continue feeding the same underlying concern, that the truth may exist much closer to Nancy's inner circle than the original ransom narrative suggested. Then, there is law enforcement itself. Because another major reason the public conversation surrounding this case has intensified involves growing criticism directed toward how the investigation was handled publicly during the opening stages. Conflicting statements, questions about evidence processing, debates surrounding surveillance details, disagreements involving crime scene management. All of that matters because public confidence in investigative conclusions becomes fragile when procedural controversies begin stacking up. And once confidence weakens, people start re-examining assumptions that previously went unchallenged. One of those assumptions was the ransom theory itself. At the beginning, the public largely accepted it. Masked suspect, Bitcoin demands, threatening notes. But now, months later, the theory appears increasingly unstable under scrutiny. No verified proof of life. No successful collection of ransom. No completed negotiation framework. No clear operational consistency. No believable explanation for the abandoned medication. And no convincing reason why so many roads in this investigation continue leading back toward the same geographic center. That is why this case feels different now than it did in the early days after Nancy disappeared. The mystery is no longer who might have taken her. The mystery is increasingly becoming, why does the evidence keep circling the same small group of locations, movements, and relationships? Because at some point, coincidence begins losing explanatory power. And while investigators may still be working through evidence privately, the public narrative surrounding this case has clearly shifted. People are no longer only asking whether strangers entered Nancy's home. They are asking whether the entire ransom framework may have functioned as misdirection from the very beginning, a narrative layered over a much more personal event. That possibility becomes even heavier when you revisit the single detail that continues haunting this case more than any other. The medication, because in many ways, that untouched medication bottle sitting quietly inside Nancy Guthrie's home may symbolize the collapse of the entire original story. If ransom truly mattered, the medication leaves with the hostage. Every time, no exceptions. That one contradiction continues unraveling everything around it. The communications, the emotional apology, the missing proof of life, the operational inconsistencies, the geographic convergence, the access questions, the familiarity with the property, all of it begins collapsing inward around that central problem. And now, the investigation sits at a crossroads. Either there is an explanation capable of reconciling all these contradictions into a coherent ransom operation, or the original narrative surrounding Nancy Guthrie's disappearance was never the real story at all. If you have followed this investigation from the beginning, subscribe now to Apex Crime Analyst, because this case is still evolving, and the deeper the evidence is examined, the more the unanswered questions appear to point towards something far more personal than the public was originally told. Because somewhere inside this tightening geographic circle, someone almost certainly knows exactly what happened the night Nancy Guthrie disappeared. And eventually, one contradiction too many may force the truth into the open.